This week we're talking about life in industrial America. This is to summarize it as sort of life between 1877 and 1900. And I've chosen these two pictures because on the left you have a painting of the Homestead Strike of 1892, which wasn't painted at the time. It's not like the painter was standing there with his canvas as all this stuff was going on because it was quite a violent strike. But this was painted a little bit later that year based on a number of drawings and cartoons and sketches that people had made of the actual strike. And on the right is a picture of a white man, a white southerner, posting laws and restrictions on education qualifications. And the joke here is that this white man is actually extremely uneducated and can't spell the words education, can't spell qualifications, can't spell all kinds of stuff. Yet he's making the laws. An ignorant white man is making laws, and the black man on the side in the background, who may be ignorant or may not be ignorant, can't vote because this ignorant racist white man is making new state laws. That's what we call part of the life in the New South, or what was called the Redeemer South. But let me talk first, before we move on, more about the Homestead Strike. It pitted one of the nation's leading industrial corporations against a powerful union, the Amalgamated Association. Amalgamated Association represented the skilled iron and steel workers among the Carnegie Steel's complex's 3,800 employees. Homestead's 12 steel mills were the most profitable and technologically advanced in the world. The union contract gave the Amalgamated Association a considerable say in the operation of the Carnegie Steel plant, including the right to approve the hiring of new workers and to regulate the pace of work. To Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick, his partner and chairman of Carnegie Steel, the union's power increasingly seemed an intolerable infringement on management's rights. In 1892, they decided to operate the plant on a non-union basis. Only workers who agreed not to join the union could work at Homestead. In response, the workers, including the unskilled laborers not included in the Amalgamated Association, blockaded the steelworks and mobilized support from the local community. A battle took place on July 6, 1892, when armed strikers confronted 300 private policemen from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. 7 workers and 3 Pinkerton agents were killed, and when armed, and the Pinkertons were forced to retreat. 4 days later, the governor of Pennsylvania dispatched 8,000 militiamen to open the complex on management's terms. The strikers actually held out until November, but the union's defeat was now inevitable. In the end, the Amalgamated Association was destroyed. The Carnegie Corporation's tactics and the workers' solidarity won the strikers widespread national sympathy. Overwhelmingly widespread national sympathy on the workers' side. But Homestead demonstrated that neither a powerful union nor public opinion could influence the conduct of the largest corporations. 2 American ideas of freedom collided at Homestead. One was the employer's definition, based on the idea that property rights, unrestrained by union rules or public regulation, sustain the public good. And on the other hand, the workers' conception, which stressed economic security and independence from what was considered the, quote, tyranny of employers. The strife at Homestead also reflected broader social battles over American freedom during the 1890s. Like the Homestead workers, many Americans came to believe that they were being denied economic independence and democratic self-government, long central to the popular understanding of freedom. During the 1890s, millions of farmers joined the populist movement in an attempt to reverse their declining economic prospects and to rescue the government from what they saw as controlled by powerful corporate interests. The 1890s witnessed the imposition of a new racial system in the South that locked African Americans into the status of second-class citizenship, denying them many of the freedoms that white Americans took for granted. And that's the second part of this lecture. That's why I have that second image up there. Let me first talk about farmers and populists, because remember, what we keep saying in this course is that industrial America also includes farming, because farming becomes heavily industrialized and heavily mechanized. Like workers, farmers in the South and West faced growing economic insecurity as agricultural prices fell and economic dependency on merchants and banks increased. Sharecropping kept millions of black and white Southern farmers in poverty, and an oversupply of world cotton led to dramatic price increases that threatened Southern farmers' livelihoods and property. These farmers soon blamed their woes on railroads' high freight charges, on high interest loans from bankers and merchants, and the fiscal policies of the federal government that reduced the money supply and farm prices. In response, farmers organized the Farmers Alliance in Texas in the late 1870s, which quickly spread to dozens of states. The alliance at first stayed away from politics and established cooperatives called exchanges to finance and market crops. But when banks refused to loan money for the exchanges, the alliance proposed what was known as the sub-treasury plan. That is, the federal government would establish warehouses where farmers could store their crops until sold, and by using the crops as collateral, the government would issue loans directly to farmers at low interest rates, ending their dependence on bankers and merchants for credit. Demands for the sub-treasury led the alliance to politics. Now, during the early 1890s, the alliance formed the People's Party, called the Populists, more or less the era's greatest political insurgency. The Populists appealed not just to farmers, but to all producers, including miners, industrial workers, and small business people. But most of its supporters were cotton and wheat farmers in the South and West. The Populists organized massive educational campaigns using pamphlets, newspapers, and revival-style mass meetings throughout the country. This was the last expression of the 19th century idea that America was a commonwealth of small producers whose freedom rested on individual ownership of productive property and the dignity of labor. But the Populists were forward-looking, embracing scientific methods of agriculture and modern technologies that made large-scale cooperatives possible. These included the railroad, telegraph, national market, and they wanted the federal government to regulate them for the public interest. It was a very 20th century idea. Further, the Populists believed that the government could move beyond partisan conflict to promote the public vision. The Populists believed the government could move beyond partisan conflict to promote the public good. Here's a photograph from the 1890s showing Kansas populists, a group of Kansas populists, may be on their way to a political gathering, but there certainly is. It's a populist march. It's a populist procession, and so most historians believe that this was taken on the way to a populist gathering. And this is a cartoon, a picture of Tom Watson, who was a populist leader from Georgia, and it was put on the cover of the party's campaign book for 1892. The Populists adopted a famous platform for their 1892 Omaha Convention. It proposed many measures to restore democracy and economic opportunity for ordinary Americans, some of which came to pass in the next century, such as the direct election of U.S. senators, which seems like a really highly technical thing, but is actually extremely important, government control of the currency, a graduated income tax, low-cost public financing for farmers, and workers' rights to organize unions. The platform also called for national ownership of railroads to allow farmers to inexpensively get their crops to market. In some parts of the South, the Populists heroically tried to unite black and white farmers on a common political and economic program, but the barriers were too great. Racism, the legacy of the Civil War, and the fact that many white Populists were landowning farmers while black farmers were tenants and agricultural laborers facing a different set of problems all mitigated against such an alliance. Certainly mitigated against the alliance becoming very broad. Black farmers organized their own Cotton Farmers Alliance, whose strikes were suppressed by white authorities, some of whom were even sympathetic to the white populists. While white populists were hardly anti-racist, some recognized that whites would have to appeal to blacks in order to break the Democratic Party's hold on the South and its opposition to reform. And in a few places like North Carolina, white and black populists together won state elections. In most of the South, however, Democrats defeated the populists by mobilizing whites to vote against Negro supremacy, quote unquote, intimidating and also intimidated blacks and rigged elections. The populists also engaged the reform efforts of farmer and middle-class women and endorsed women's suffrage in many states. In 1892, the populist candidate for president, James Weaver, won more than 1 million votes, and the party carried 5 western states and elected 3 governors and 15 members of Congress. This is an 1891 cartoon from a Texas populist newspaper. Northern and Southern Civil War veterans clasp hands across the bloody chasm, a phrase that was first used by New York editor Horace Greeley during his campaign for president in 1872. Beneath each figure is an explanation of why voting alignments had been previously based on sectionalism. The North feared rebel rule, and the white South feared Negro supremacy. And this is a map showing populist strength near the end of the century in 1892. Okay, percentage of the presidential vote in 1892, and you see an awful lot of western states, North Dakota, Kansas, Colorado, Nevada, Idaho, very, very strong. Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, not as strong. Alabama, not as strong. But still, probably the most significant and the most successful third party until the 1960s. Now, this is a cartoon populism in women's suffrage. Most populists in the West supported women's suffrage. In a cartoon published in a Colorado populist newspaper in July 4th, 1894, a man and woman celebrate the passage of a referendum giving the women the right to vote, giving women the right to vote in that state. So how does the government respond to populists? Well, when a severe depression in 1893 intensified conflict between labor and capital, it seemed that the populists might gain the votes of industrial workers who had traditionally supported the two major parties. Employers used state or federal authority to protect their economic power and suppress labor unrest. In May 1894, the federal government dispersed Coxey's Army, a march of unemployed men led by Jacob Coxey, an Ohio businessman, that converged on the nation's capital. And you can find lots of pictures about that. In fact, I'll show you one in a minute. Also in 1894, workers in the company-owned town of Pullman, Illinois, called a strike to protest a reduction in wages. The American Railway Union, with 150,000 members, announced they would not handle Pullman cars. The boycott crippled National Rail Service, and through President Grover Cleveland, an injunction was obtained that ordered the strikers back to work. The strike collapsed after the union's leaders, including Eugene Debs, were jailed. The Supreme Court later confirmed their sentences and approved the use of injunctions against striking labor unions. Now, in 1894, the populists doubled their efforts to appeal to industrial workers, and in state and congressional elections that year, with the Depression worsening, voters abandoned the Democrats. The populist vote in rural areas increased, but most workers did not vote populist. Few populist demands spoke to workers' needs, as their calls for higher agricultural prices would raise food costs for workers and diminish the real value of their wages. And the movement's Protestant and revivalist culture alienated a lot of Catholic and immigrant workers. Urban workers instead voted for Republicans, who argued that higher tariffs would revive the economy by protecting American manufacturing and workers from imports and cheap foreign labor. The Republicans gained a massive 117 seats in the House. This is a picture, a very famous picture of Coxey's Army on the march in 1894. Now, a couple of things to note here. They're all well enough dressed. They're wearing their bowler hats. They're wearing coats and ties, shirts and ties. Okay, it isn't, and they do this deliberately to make themselves look as respectable as possible because they want to gain as much popularity with the general public as possible. And this is a picture of federal troops posing atop a railroad engine after being sent to Chicago to suppress the Pullman strike of 1894. Now we talk about labor and silver, because this is how the populist campaign and general sort of, fundamental questioning about lots of things about the American economy arise. In 1896, the Democrats and populists united behind William Jennings Bryan, a young congressman from Nebraska. Bryan had won the Democratic nomination in a speech that captured the fears and hopes of farmers. He called for the free coinage of silver, which was the unrestricted minting of silver money, and he used biblical imagery to condemn the gold standard in perhaps the most famous lines of political oratory in American history. Quote, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, end quote. Bryan's demand for free silver was the latest expression of a long-standing view that increasing the amount of currency in circulation would raise the prices of farmers' crops and make it easier for them to pay their debts. Bryan's nomination represented a shift in Democratic leadership away from elites, but Bryan's appeal was highly religious and revivalist and influenced by the social gospel. Republicans argued that gold was the only honest currency and that abandoning it would prevent economic recovery by scaring creditors away from making loans. They nominated Governor William McKinley of Ohio, who had shepherded to the high protectionist McKinley tariff in Congress in 1890. He'd shepherded it through. The 1896 election was the first modern presidential election, really. The Republicans poured an unprecedented amount of money into a highly organized campaign that used a massive educational effort directed against the Democrats' call for free silver. The results showed in a nation divided among regional lines. McKinley won the election with the votes of industrial states in the Northeast and Midwest. A labor conflict did not produce political results. Party politics seemed to mute class conflicts, not reinforce it. Industrial America, from workers to industrialists, voted solidly Republican and continued to do so for years. McKinley's victory shattered the political stalemate of the previous 20 years, launched a period of Republican dominance that would last until the 1930s, and marked a pinnacle in voter participation, which has been in decline ever since. Now, in fact, today only around half of the electorate actually casts ballots. And here is a cartoon from the magazine Judge, September 14th, 1896, condemning William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech for defiling the symbols of Christianity. Bryan tramples on the Bible while holding his golden cross. A vandalized church is visible in the background. In another populist cartoon from a Colorado newspaper, the figure of liberty directs a member of the producing classes to use the ballot box to combat the money power. Remember, Lady Liberty as a figure is by far the most dominant image in American political art, social art, really until the 60s or 70s. Here is a map of the 1896 presidential election. You can see that it's very split geographically, right? As I said a minute ago, the Midwest, the upper Midwest and the Northeast goes heavily for McKinley. The West and the South go for Bryan. One of the reasons this is not, it looks like at the very least this should be a close election, but it isn't, because these states out in the West, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, all these places have very few members of the Electoral College, whereas, New York has 36, Pennsylvania has 32, and on and on and on. Now, populism's defeat in the South allowed for the imposition of a new racial order. The Redeemers, a coalition of merchants, planners, and businessmen who ruled the region after 1877, claimed to have redeemed the South from the corruption and horrors of black rule, and they worked to reverse Reconstruction's achievements. They reduced taxes and public spending, cut back public schools, which especially hurt blacks. New laws allowed the rest of those without employment and increased punishment for petty crimes. As the South's prison population rose, convicts, mostly poor blacks, were rented out to railroads, miners, and lumber companies as cheap involuntary labor at a high profit. Labor unions in the South, most notably the Knights of Labor, assailed the convict labor system, which rented out prisoners, a majority black and in jail for petty crimes, and rented them out, of course, to private businessmen. In the 1880s, Atlanta editor Henry Grady relentlessly promoted the dream of a new South, in which industrialization and agricultural diversification would deliver prosperity to the region. While planters, merchants, and industrialists prospered, the region as a whole became impoverished. While mining and textiles developed in some areas, The region's low wages and taxes and convict labor did not spur much economic development. By 1890, except for the major iron and steel city of Birmingham, Alabama, southern cities had little industry and mostly exported cotton, tobacco, and rice. The South as a whole stayed dependent on the North for capital and manufactured goods. As late as the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would declare the South the nation's primary economic problem. And here is a picture of a group of Florida convict laborers. As I said, southern states notoriously use convicts for public labor or lease them out to work in dire conditions for private employers. And since we're talking about working conditions, this is a picture of coal miners in a photograph by Lewis Hine. Mining is one of the occupations in which blacks and whites often worked side by side. And you see in this picture, there appears to be an African-American man on the right side of the picture. That was certainly the case in northern mines. Black farmers, the most disadvantaged rural Southerners, suffered the most from the region's economic condition. In the Upper South, mines, iron mills, and tobacco factories offered some jobs to black workers, and some black farmers owned land. In the Rice Kingdom of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, the plantations went to ruin, and many blacks acquired land and became self-sufficient farmers. In most of the Deep South, however, blacks owned a smaller percentage of land in 1900 than they had in the late 1870s. In southern cities, institutions such as schools, churches, businesses, and clubs created by blacks during Reconstruction formed the basis of dynamic black urban communities. But the labor market was racially divided, and black men were excluded from skilled and professional occupations, while black women were limited to wage work as domestic servants and were excluded from occupations open to white women. Blacks, trapped at the bottom of an economically stagnant South, migrated by the tens of thousands. In 1879 and 1880, nearly 60,000 African Americans moved to Kansas, seeking political rights, safety, education, and economic opportunity. Its participants called the move the Kansas Exodus, named after the biblical account of Jews' flight from slavery in Egypt. But despite worsening conditions, most blacks had no choice but to stay in the South. While economic expansion took place in northern cities, most employers there offered jobs only to white migrants from rural areas and European immigrants, not blacks. Only in World War I did jobs open for blacks, helping to spur a massive movement northward called the Great Migration. And here is a picture of the black educator Mary McLeod Bethune with girls from the school she established in Florida in a photograph from 1905. And this is a pretty rare thing in the South, and the school was only successful because, again, Mary McLeod Bethune made it successful. And here's a poster seeking recruits for the Kansas Exodus, 1878. Ho for Kansas! Okay, you saw a lot of these around the East and the Upper South. Here's a photograph of townspeople in Nicodemus, a community established by members of the 1879-1880 exodus of Southern African Americans to Kansas. Now let me get to the issue of disenfranchisement, which was sort of adumbrated in the picture at the very beginning of the lecture of that ignorant white man creating laws, literacy laws for black voters in the South. Neither black voting nor black office holding came to an abrupt end in 1877, however. Blacks continued to cast ballots in large numbers, although Democrats solidified their control of state and local affairs by redrawing district lines and substituting appointive for elective officials in counties with black majorities. A few blacks even served in Congress in the 1880s and 1890s. Nevertheless, political opportunities became more and more restricted. For black men of talent and ambition, other avenues, business, the law, the church, increasingly seemed to offer greater opportunities for personal advancement and community service than politics did. The banner of political leadership passed to black women activists, Most female activists emerged from the small urban black middle class and preached the necessity of respectable behavior as part and parcel of the struggle for equal rights. They aided poor families, offered lessons in home life and child rearing, and battled gambling and drinking in black communities. Some poor blacks resented middle class efforts to instruct them in proper behavior, but by insisting on the right of black women to be considered respectable, at least as respectable as their white counterparts, the women reformers challenged the racial ideology that consigned all blacks to the status of degraded second-class citizens. Social movements that helped expand 19th century boundaries of freedom now revised their goals so they could be achieved in the new economic and intellectual environment. Some black leaders, for example, started to emphasize self-help and individual self-advancement into middle-class America as an alternative to politics. Booker T. Washington symbolized this change in black life. In 1895, Washington delivered a speech called the Atlanta Compromise at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition, urging blacks to accommodate segregation and cease agitation for civil and political rights. He founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a center for vocational training, education for jobs, not broad liberal arts, as he believed obtaining farms and skilled work was more important than full citizenships for blacks. He told a white audience in Atlanta, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as one as the hand, and all things essential to mutual progress. Whites who wanted a docile labor force that would not form unions and work cheaply embraced his vision, while many blacks supported him from a belief that direct assaults on white power were failures and that blacks should build up their own communities. Between 1890 and 1906, every Southern state enacted laws or constitutional provisions intended to eliminate the black vote. Now, because the 15th Amendment prohibited the use of race as a qualification for suffrage, Southern lawmakers designed laws that seemed colorblind, but were meant to keep blacks from voting. Most popular were the poll tax, a fee a citizen must pay in order to be eligible to vote, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and a requirement that a voter show an understanding of the state constitution. Now, although some white leaders presented this disenfranchisement as a good government measure that would end fraud and violence in elections, it was a means for ending black participation in politics, and it worked. By 1940, only 3% of adult blacks in the South were registered to vote. Poor and illiterate whites were also disenfranchised by these laws, but the people at the polling booth, the people running the polling booth, didn't have to apply the literacy test or these other tests to absolutely everyone. They got to decide who was going to take a literacy test and be led into the polling booth. So lots of illiterate whites were able to vote in that way. Disenfranchisement led to a generation of Southern demagogue politicians who mobilized white voters by appealing to their racism. And disenfranchisement could not have occurred without Northern approval. In 1891, the Senate defeated a proposal to protect black voting rights in the South, and the Supreme Court approved disenfranchisement laws. According to the 14th Amendment, any state that deprived its male citizens of the franchise was supposed to lose part of its representation in Congress, but this was not held to apply to blacks. Thus, Southern congressmen, as they had since the very, very beginning of the country, had far greater power than their small electorates warranted. Here is a picture of Booker T. Washington, again, who was that advocate of industrial education and economic self-help. And Native Americans, who we haven't talked about much in this lecture, were very important. Here at the Hampton Institute, a Native American traditional attire appears at a history class at the Hampton Institute in Virginia, which was a vocational school established for freed slaves and Indians after the Civil War. Now, this photograph was taken around 1890, and what it's suggesting is the Native Americans are part of history, not members of a living culture. Alongside disenfranchisement in the 1890s, segregation was imposed throughout the South. Laws and local customs that required separating the races had existed in the North before the Civil War and during Reconstruction. Southern schools and other white institutions had been segregated. In the 1880s, though, race relations in the South were fluid, with some railroads, theaters, and hotels admitting blacks and whites, while others discriminated. In 1883, the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had outlawed racial discrimination by hotels and other public facilities, and held that the 14th Amendment banned unequal treatment by state authorities, not private businesses. In the landmark 1896 ruling Plessy v. Ferguson, the court approved state laws requiring separate facilities for blacks and whites, arguing that segregated facilities did not discriminate as long as they were separate but equal. States responded to Plessy by passing laws requiring segregation in nearly every part of Southern life: schools, hospitals, toilets, cemeteries. Despite the doctrine of separate but equal, facilities for blacks were either inferior or non-existent. Segregation was an important part of the system of white supremacy in the South, in which each part, such as disenfranchisement, economic inequality, and inferior education, reinforced the others. Segregation did not so much keep races apart as ensure that whites would have the advantage wherever they did meet. A racial social etiquette developed in which blacks had to give way to whites on sidewalks and could not raise their voices at whites or be otherwise assertive. Segregation also affected other groups, including Chinese laborers in Mississippi and Mexican Americans in California. Okay, here's a photograph of a black school. Again, as in Plessy versus Ferguson, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that laws establishing racial segregation did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as long as the facilities were separate but equal. Of course, in fact, this was never the case, right? This is illustrated by this photograph of elementary school for white children in a town called for black children in South Boston, Virginia, in the early 20th century. And when we compare that to the school on the next slide for white children, you'll see exactly what I mean. And here is that white school, again in the same town, right, in South Boston, Virginia. Probably not that far from the other school, because South Boston, Virginia is a tiny town. And you can just tell just by the physical structure of the building that separate but not equal certainly was fantasy. Now we get to one of the most distressing aspects of American history, and certainly perhaps the most distressing aspect of American history in this period. Blacks who challenged white supremacy or refused to accept the indignities of segregation faced political and legal power and immediate violent reprisal. In each year between 1883 and 1905, more than 50 persons, most of them black, were lynched, that is, killed by a mob, in the South. Lynching continued well into the 20th century. Some were secret, others were public and promoted by organizations and by the media. Lynchings often resulted in atrocities against the victims, and law enforcement rarely prevented lynching or punished lynchers. Many victims were accused of having raped or assaulted white women, an allegation often without basis, as proved by Ida B. Wells, the nation's leading anti-lynching crusader. But many white Southerners considered preserving white womanhood a sufficient basis for this extrajudicial murder. Lynching is virtually unknown as a phenomenon anywhere else in the world. The reconciliation of the North and the South in the 1880s and 1890s came at the cost of widespread hopes for racial equality that had existed during and after the Civil War. In popular literature and at veterans' reunions, the war came to be remembered as a tragic quarrel between brothers, in which blacks had played no role, and which had been caused by clashes over states' rights and the preservation of the Union, not by slavery. Reconstruction came to be universally seen as a period of black misrule imposed on the South by the North, a view that legitimized disenfranchisement and segregation in the South. Southern governments and schools celebrated the lost cause of the Confederacy and condemned the evils of Reconstruction. Even as Northern Protestants abandoned the concern for racial justice and turned to sectional reconciliation, Southern churches played a role in keeping the idea of the Old South alive by refusing to unite with Northern branches. Nationwide, textbooks emphasizing images of happy slaves and black troops fighting in the Civil War were all but forgotten. And at times when black veterans sought to participate in memorials, they were met with violence from whites. This is the title page of Lynch Law, in which the journalist and lecturer Ida B. Wells, as you see there, exposed the horror of lynching and demonstrated that the justification for murder conducted by Southern white mobs, that justification was that the black male victims had sexually assaulted white women, was a myth. And here's a table of states with over 200 lynchings between 1889 to 1918. You see the Deep South is really, really, really bad. Okay, Deep South has Georgia, Mississippi, more than 100 more than Arkansas, for instance. And here's a very famous photograph of a crowd at an aftermath of a lynching of Laura Nelson and her teenage son, J.D. Nelson, African-American residents of Okemah, Oklahoma, in 1911. They were accused of shooting to death a deputy sheriff who had come to the Nelson home to investigate the theft of livestock. A week after being lodged in jail, they were removed by a mob and taken to the bridge. Members of the mob raped Mrs. Nelson before the lynching. The photograph was reproduced as a postcard and sold at local stores. And as in most lynchings, no one was prosecuted for the crime. And finally, one of the ways in which the sort of lost cause is most highly shown is this carving by an unknown Southerner from around 1875, which juxtaposes Robert E. Lee and the crucified Christ, illustrating the strong religious overtones in the ideology of the lost cause, which only supported and only strengthened that lost cause.